This is Knowledge Engineering with Semantic Web Technologies. Welcome to the very last part of lecture number 3 on ontologies and logic. And today we want to talk about a little bit ontology. And I want to give you a brief introduction into the history of ontology. So you can lean back. This is not part of the course that will be scored anymore. This is simply just for your information. And please, all philosophers, don't crucify me because I will not be as explicit and as specific as sometimes necessary. This is, of course, a simplification of everything which can be said about ontology, and it's intended simply for computer scientists. So what is ontology? First, the word comes from the Greek, we see that, and of course it consists of 2 syllables. So first is on, which is a participle of to be, and logia, which means science. So usually the simplified definition that you can find in Wikipedia, for example, says it's a philosophical study of the nature of being, existence, or reality, as well as the basic categories of beings and their relation. So this is the course simplified definition of what ontology in philosophy means. So ontology deals with the general questions: what does exist and what can be said to exist. So always here in these first few slides you will see on the right side some book covers, book frontispieces, where the term ontology occurred first somewhere in the time of Enlightenment during the 1800s. So this is just for illustration. What we have to distinguish is in ontology, so in ontology we are dealing with so-called general metaphysics, where the being itself, and this is a categorical being, is described. And we have to distinguish this from epistemology, where everything is described with how the world can be perceived with our senses. So in general metaphysics, it's only our thinking, the ratio. And in epistemology, we are dependent on our sensory input. That, of course, we can perceive the world, or it's the only way we can perceive the world. So this has to be distinguished, and the ontology part is on the general metaphysics part here. So what are the fundamental questions of ontology that are treated in that kind of discipline? So first of all, what does it mean for a being to be? And there you ask several questions, or many questions, and one of the most simplest is: when can we say 2 things are really identical? So you can define this, and of course you have to give a proper sound definition for that. Then another part is if everything that is everything that exists also real? So does it really is it real in a conceptual way of being? And does something exist if it's only possible, or does it exist if it's necessary? So you see, philosophers are of course arguing from different directions. What does it mean to be? And the point is, of course, one of the very important questions here is: are there things that do not exist? Yeah, and if they not exist, how is it that we can talk about these things? Or is the non-existing non-existing? You see, of course, these are rather sophisticated philosophical questions that might be raised and answered, and most times only discussed in ontology. And the second part, which deals with the categories, asks what categories of objects do exist. And there, of course, you can also ask lots of questions, like, for example, do things exist that are only unique or only multiple? This is the question for the so-called universalia. Or do things exist that are unilaterally dependent of others? So here you ask for substances. And if there is a dependency like that, of which sort is that dependency? So you ask for causality. Then you say, okay, substances and things, they are described by properties. So do necessary property exists? So you ask for essences. And if you are looking at things that are somehow composed, how do they relate to their components? So this would be questions that are asked to define or to derive a categorical system of the world. So these are the fundamental questions. When we look at the word again, of course, this word did not turn up in antiquity, so the word is rather new. It turned up here in the 1606. It turns first up in Latin in a book by Jakob Lorhardt in his book Octua Scholastica, and then in German you see in a German book by Rudolf Göckel in 1613, also in a kind of encyclopedia in Lexicon Philosophicum, and in English then it took a while, 50 years. So in Gideon Harvis you see here the frontispiece of his work, New Principles of Philosophy, and of course there in metaphysics he was referring to ontology as metaphysics. So there are the first occurrences of the word ontology somewhere in printed form or in scientific texts. The first who really gave a categorization of ontology within the framework of the philosophy was Christian Wolff. Maybe you have never heard of this German guy, Christian Wolff, who was, let's say, the most important philosopher between Kant and Leibniz. And he categorizes the philosophical discipline ontology as being part of metaphysics, and in particular of so-called general metaphysics, so metaphysica generalis, and he calls it here also philosophia prima. And this classical philosophy or classical ontology that he is dealing with, or that he is describing, deals with the relation of being and existing, and existence. These are two completely different things. So the being side, so this is the question about categoriality, and the existence side, that is what is really in the world. So that is the question of things that really exist and can be seen, perceived in the world as well. So this question is also rather intensively discussed with Martin Heidegger when he's talking about the so-called ontological difference. So also famous philosopher. But let's start somewhere in antiquity. So let's see how the concept of ontology, the concept of general metaphysics has developed. But this is only really very, very brief in a nutshell. So in Greek philosophy, we start with one of the first interesting Greek philosophers called Parmenides. So he lived here in the 6th or 5th century BC. And he already was occupied with these fundamental questions of being. So he was asking, what are the fundamental categories of existence? And in the course of that, he was also referring to or he was looking for an argument against the so-called nothingness. He said nothingness is not able, cannot exist, this does not exist. And so he denied the possible existence of a void. And I have a few words of him, or a quotation of him here from his text On Nature, the Way of Truth. So he said, for this view that which is not exist can never predominate, you must debar your thought from this way of search, nor let ordinary experience in its variety force you along this way, namely that of allowing the eye, sightless as it is, and the ear full of sound, and the tongue to rule. You must judge by means of the reason, the much contested proof, which is expounded by me. So he gave proofs that can be experienced only by reason. So he said you should not trust your senses, you should trust your mind when you do philosophy. So this is a really important point that he made when he started his philosophical analysis. So he was right at the start of Greek philosophy, and then the most important philosopher is maybe Socrates, and maybe you can get a glimpse of its importance because philosophers usually divide the time or divide the antique philosophers in two areas. Ones are called pre-Socratic and the other ones came after Socrates. So he was somehow at the point where these philosophers can be divided into categories. So he was rather important. The only problem with Socrates, and all of you have heard for sure the name of Socrates, is we don't have any writings of Socrates. So there are only so-called secondary sources about him that are available from his disciples like Plato or Xenophon. And this is also referred to as the Socratic question or Socratic problem, because it is not quite clear whether these people, especially Plato in his dialogues and in his texts, refers to Socrates' ideas or if he adds something of its own contribution. So many things which are referred to Socrates, or Plato wrote dialogues, and in that dialogues often there are persons who are talking with each other. And of course one of the persons, sometimes it's Socrates, and of course he gives Socrates some of these prominent thoughts that he has to phrase, and we don't know whether this is really something which Socrates had said in real life or whether this is something which Plato has added to Socrates' saying. So this is the difficult Socratic question. So nevertheless, we have to mention him here. What we know for sure was he had a special way to educate his disciples. So, and this way is called as is referred to as the Socratic method, and this was called kind of a structured dialogue. See, he was always asking educated questions to people, and by asking people questions, they realized, by answering these questions, which often refer to something really obvious, that they do not really know about these things that he was questioning. So, and by the way he was asking, he started them to think about these problems. And this, of course, is a way of pedagogy. So this is, of course, education. So to solve a problem, break it down into a series of questions. This was the contribution of Socrates. So then came his disciples. First, the most important one, Plato, so here in the 4th and 3rd century BC. And he also was the first, for us programmers and computer scientists, he might be referred to as the first person who thought about object-oriented programming. But I will tell you about that afterwards. So his conception of the world was that he distinguished between an ideal world, a world of ideal forms, and all the so-called physical reflections, which are really there in the world. So in the physical reflections, this is the physical universe that you perceive with your senses. There the things really exist as objects. You have a sensory perception of them. But of course, they are mutable. They are perishable. They deteriorate. So they are subject to time, and time, of course, changes things there. But besides of that, there is also his world of ideas, the world of the mind, where there are the essences of things, the ideals, the archetypal things. And this, he says, is the true reality. All what we see with our senses is the physical universe that we can perceive with our senses. So there's a difference. And the relation between both he was referring to a lot in his philosophical writings. And of course, if you see the world like that, if you have a division between concepts and classes which belong to the ideal world, the noosphere as he called it, the world of idea, and the entities and instances, which means the real world objects, which are merely the shadows of ideas, then you end up with something with a modeling concept, which is closely related to modeling as you know it in object-oriented design or object-oriented programming. So therefore, Plato can be called the godfather of all programmers. Then, of course, in his ideal world, he also developed a structure within that. So he defined a hierarchy with the idea of the good as being on top in this hierarchy, and all others are somehow subsequent following and are subordered. So this was Plato. Another famous disciple, again a generation later, was Aristotle, and he is especially famous because then also his writings were canonized by the Christian philosophers later on. So he defined metaphysics as the so-called first philosophy, and he did a lot of very interesting things also for us here related to the semantic web. So the first thing what he did, he designed a concept or a schema of categories, a general and exhaustive account of the things that really are in his categories. And another thing which is really important, he also was dealing with the kind of predecessor of our first order logic in his writings called Organon. And here he described logic as a tool set for science with syllogisms. We will see about that. So more than that, he also was interested in the concept of how communication works, and he also developed a predecessor concept of that semiotic triangle that we have already heard of right in the first lecture. So he wrote, for example, those things therefore which are in the voice are symbols of the passions of the soul, and when written are symbols of the passions in the voice. And as there are not the same letters among all men, so neither have all the same voices, yet those passions of the soul, of which these are primarily the signs, are the same among all. The things also, of which these are the similitudes, are the same. So he clearly distinguished of the symbols of the language and, of course, which is stated with the voice, and the physical objects in the world, and also the conception of that, so the concept. So this is a predecessor of the semiotic triangle, what he was here referring to. But let's have a look at his category system. You see here in specific visualizations. So the basic categories of Plato, they are here in red at the leaves of exactly this tree that is shown here. And basically he distinguished between substance, which stands of its own, of all the other things which are nothing less than properties or qualities of a substance, or which are somehow related to a substance. You perceive this much better if you look at the examples we are giving here. So substance, for example, he distinguishes between primary substance and secondary substance, which somehow gives then an overview of species or is more general. So primary substance would be this man, this horse, and the species, then the secondary substance would be man or horse. And then he says, okay, quality. Quality you can ask for if you ask for how much, and this can be discrete or continuous. You can say, yeah, 2 meters or 3 pieces. This relates, of course, to some kind of substance. Then you have quality. So what kind is this thing? Or you give a description like black, white, hot, sweet, or something like that. Then he says, okay, things can have a relation. So this means towards something. So you say double, half, larger. You put your quality into relation with that. Then, of course, you can ask for place and time. So where and when. Where would be in the marketplace, at home, and when could be yesterday, last year, now, or whenever. Then he says position is a very important attribute here. So it's about the posture or the attitude. Is it this thing, the sitting, lying, standing? And in what state is it? In what condition? So, for example, it can be armed, for example. Then the action, so what does it? So what makes it? So, for example, then you heat something up or you cool something down. This would be the action. And then you can also describe the affection, which means the passion to suffer or to undergo something. So to be land, to be heated, to be cooled would be then the vice versa if you affect something. So this would be the division in so-called primary categories, which is used to describe the world. And Aristotle's category system has been reused later. We will come back to that because this is the basis for fundamental or so-called top-level ontologies. What he also did in his writing called Organon, he defined so-called syllogisms. And these are nothing else but deduction rules. Of course, these kind of deduction rules were given in natural language, and these were inference rules all built according to a same pattern. So one of these deduction rules, for example, is all humans are mortal, all Greeks are humans, therefore all Greeks are also mortal. So this is some kind of a deduction rule, and there were several of that. And of course, when you studied logic in earlier times, or when you study philosophy, you all have to learn them by heart. But now, of course, we have real first-order logic, and then we can do this in a more formal way, much more easily than in the natural language way, like you study Aristotle's syllogisms. Later on, so after the turn of the time, so if you look here at the 3rd or 4th century, we have again scientists who try to work on what the older philosophers have done. So, for example, Porphyry of Tyrus, he was a good teacher and he tried to simplify somehow Aristotle's writings. So he has a textbook for beginners, it's called Isagoge, and there he simply shows how these Aristotelian categories can be understood simply also by beginners and students of philosophy. And the nice thing what he also did is he extended also the Aristotelian category system, and he broke down the first principal concept of substance into 5 components. And he said, yeah, substance can be genus or genus, species, difference, property, or accident. So don't mind what all these things mean, so you can look it up, for example, in Wikipedia. Another thing also from his first book, there developed during the Middle Ages a kind of visualization, because people of course realized sometimes if you are writing things down in natural language, of course they are subject to interpretation, and sometimes it's really difficult to describe these things, and visualizations give you a way to understand these difficult concepts better. So they tried somehow here to organize these categories of Aristotle, emphasized or extended by Porphyry, in this so-called tree of Porphyry, or tree of knowledge. So this is a first or early visualization of these Aristotelian categories. And then later on in the Middle Ages also, the philosophers were always dealing somehow with ontological problems. Also during the medieval time of scholasticism, so this was during the 12th to 15th century, there are 3 of the most important philosophers there, Anselm of Canterbury, Thomas Aquinas, or William of Ockham. The first of them, they were spoken highly, were spoken saint, or were saints of the Roman Catholic Church. William of Ockham not, he was a Franciscan, and probably you've heard of Ockham's razor, according to how to draw logical conclusions or give logical explanations. Always choose the more simplest one. This is a contribution, a philosophical contribution by William of Ockham. But concerning the ontology, so one of the big questions that was somehow discussed during the Middle Ages was the problems of the universals. You remember the universals? So the problem is a universal, so a general concept, an idea, an abstract idea. Does this possess an ontological real existence? So are universals really real, or are they just something which we can describe but that do not exist really in the world? So there were 2 schools. One were the so-called realists that said, yeah, universals do exist, and there were the nominalists which says, no, universals are nothing but words and symbols. And you might think this is not an important question. Of course, it is an important question, at least in Christianity, simply because they ask, is the universal, which is called the good, the universal good, which is, of course, the same as God, is this really real or not? Or does evil, which is also a universal, is it real? Does it exist in the world? Does the devil really exist in the world? So this was interesting questions, and of course, it depended on the way you were arguing, and you had to be careful, of course, not to violate canonic law, so not to violate somehow the laws of the church in your argumentation. So this was a dangerous time for philosophers. Another thing what they did there with ontologies was, for example, they tried to give also some concepts of the faith, some structures. So for example, here you have this Trinity example, so the Christian doctrine of Trinity, and they say, for example, of course, God is the same as the Father, as the Son, as the Holy Ghost, but of course, in between they are not the same. So this is the visualization of a difficult or really sophisticated argumentation that you can here somehow follow. But also some interesting or more modern ideas dropped up or came up during the Middle Ages. Here, a Spanish guy, Ramon Lull, he lived in the 13th and 14th century, and he used also this tree of knowledge, combined it with logic and made a decision tree out of it. So he was the first to use this Aristotelian system of categories together with logic as some predecessor of a logical machine here, as a decision tree. So he was also the first who defined logic as the art and science to distinguish between truth or lie with the help of reason, to accept truth and to reject lie. So this was a rather important contribution. If we go on in time, and now looking at the time of Enlightenment, 17th, 18th century, so there one guy is really important. He's also one of the founders of the Royal Society. So it was an English scientist, John Wilkins, a philosopher, and he found out that our natural language, of course, is ambiguous and inaccurate. And of course, this inaccuracy and ambiguity impede scientific progress, simply also because it was really complicated to understand these philosophical elaborations from ancient time that have been translated and retranslated and retranslated, and of course, sometimes also by people who did not understand the text. You can imagine that this, of course, is difficult. Today, for many things, we have a formal system. So like, for example, in mathematics, we are using formal listens to, also in logic, to give definitions, to show proofs. If you do this only in ambiguous natural language, this is really, really complicated. And John Wilkins said, yeah, we could develop something like an universal philosophical language which avoids completely the ambiguities. And the goal would be, we want to represent the entire knowledge of the universe with the help of this universal philosophical language. So he had the idea, but he failed, of course, somehow to implement this and how to put this to reality. So he had no idea how to make this. But of course, it was the first and really interesting idea. One who went a step further in his thinking was Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, one of the most famous and most interesting, most brilliant mathematicians of all time. So you might remember him. Together with Newton, they developed the calculus out of nothing. And this is really amazing. So he developed also an idea, considering also the ideas here of John Wilkins, and he said, okay, we could use, of course, numbers to represent or use numbers as a universal philosophic language. So he developed the idea of so-called characteristic numbers as a model for Aristotelian logic, in the hope also to solve logical problems with the help then of some kind of calculus. So he tried to mechanize thinking. We have already talked about that. So his characteristic numbers then, of course, were also prime numbers, and he developed a system how to deal with that, how to represent knowledge with that. So he said, it is obvious that if we could find characters or signs suited for expressing all our thoughts as clearly and as exactly as arithmetic expresses numbers or geometry expresses lines, we could do in all matters insofar as they are subject to reasoning all that we can do in arithmetic and geometry. For all investigations which depend on reasoning would be carried out by transposing these characters and by a species of calculus. As easy as that. Yeah, of course. And we, with ontology, somehow are also referring to Leibniz if we are seeking or looking for a well-suited knowledge representation. Then, of course, the most important philosopher during times of Enlightenment was Immanuel Kant, and also he was, of course, thinking about ontology. But he turned himself towards epistemology in his criticism of pure reason, in his Kritik an der reinen Vernunft. And he asked the fundamental question, how can our mind perceive the world? Nevertheless, he also tried to adapt or develop his own system of categories in the Aristotelian tradition. So what can be said about his categories is, in his Critic of Pure Reason, Kant arrives at his list of categories by first enumerating the forms of possible judgment. On this view, objective empirical judgments are endowed with their objectivity and generality in virtue of the a priori concepts embodied in the relevant forms of judgment. If we can identify all of the possible forms of objective empirical judgment, we can then hope to use them as a basis to discover all of the most general concepts or categories that are employed in making such judgments, and thus that are employed in any cognition of objects. So this was somehow he started also his categorical system with deriving the ways of how I can judge things, how I can determine the quality of things. So his judgment functions that he had here were judgment of quantity, judgment of quality, judgment of relation, and judgment of modality. And then he derived categories that you see here that usually exist or consist of two contradicting or complementing pairs like unity and totality. And there was something in between here like plurality. So for quality reasons, for example, he defined categories like reality and negation, and in between some were the limitations. So for relation, he defined substance and accident, cause and effect, and reciprocity. And for modality, he said, yeah, we have existence, and it's surrounded by possibility and necessity. So, yeah, there is, of course, much more to be said about Kant's categories, and it's really difficult to understand. He wrote a lot about it and defined a lot about it. So if you are interested in that, of course, I invite you to read his writings, or even better, you write or you read people who have read and understood and compiled and aggregated the thoughts of Kant. But ontology, of course, does not stop with these people. So during the course or since the Enlightenment, of course, many important philosophers all have thought and have contributed to ontology. Schopenhauer, for example, that you see here, or Wittgenstein, Heidegger, also Jean-Paul Sartre or Bernard Russell you see here. So you can look up works or their contribution of ontology in the books, or if you are interested, also in Wikipedia. But from all their notions of ontology, of course, we also take as computer scientists the part that is interesting for us, for representing knowledge. And our knowledge representation ontologies, for example, have their foundation also in philosophy. Here is an example for, we have already had this KR, knowledge representation ontology by John F. Sowa. And as you see here, this ontology is ordered in some kind of a lattice, and it is based on Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy and Charles Sanders Peirce semiotic, and it contains lots of concepts that are related somehow and ordered here in this lattice. So this is a top-level ontology that we use in computer science, and based on these ontologies, then huge knowledge bases are built. So OpenPsych is another ontology which is the top, or which is the core of a huge knowledge base. So it has been originally developed in the 1980s and still exists and is being extended. You find it here at openpsych.org. You can look it up, and it's a comprehensive ontology and knowledge base that contains everyday common sense knowledge. So it contains about 240,000 entities, more than 2 million axioms, and provide links also to other knowledge bases like the DBpedia, to FOVE, WordNet, and many, many more. So this is a rather interesting tool then also to work with. So I invite you to look this up. Or DBpedia, we all have dealt already with DBpedia, and we will also in the future of the lecture deal with DBpedia. The core of DBpedia is also an ontology. And this is also kind of a top-level ontology which tries to distinguish or to define somehow cross-domain knowledge about the entities that are represented in DBpedia. It's a shallow ontology, of course. It only consists of 685 classes, and you see here about 3,000 properties. But it's essentially the core of DBpedia, which in the English version has more than 4 billion instances which relate exactly to that ontology. So we will have a much more closer look on that one later on in the course of the lecture. So we have come to an end of that lecture. You have learned now a little bit or heard a little bit of ontology. I really invite you to learn more about that, to read more books, because also the philosophical part is really interesting for us as computer scientists. In the next lecture, we will learn about OWL, the web ontology language, we will look at rules, and we will deepen our knowledge in reasoning.